Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine the 17th of June of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And the most important updates are coming from Arechov bridgehead from the Battle of Arechov. And this video we're going to start with the western flank of that battle. We're going to talk about the two settlements, Zheribyanki and Petykhatki, where the Ukrainians during the previous few days made at least several attempts to push the Russians and took back from the settlement and to capture this settlement. The Ukrainians were using at least two directions to attack that settlement. The first direction relied on the road between Maly-Sherbaki, Stepova to the south, and the Minister of Defense of Russian Federation reported that during the previous 24 hours the Ukrainians were sending a lot of convoys to the south using that road. One of that convoy was spotted, discovered by the Russians, and as a result of artillery and bombing attack, the Ukrainians lost at least 5 fighting infantry vehicles on that road. Anyway, the Ukrainians managed to send some reserves, and during the previous day they managed to establish some positions on the northern part of that settlement. Another direction, the second direction of Ukrainian attack, where took place between this river and the forest on the western side of that settlement. The Ukrainians were attacking using the smoke screens, and probably that tactic was very effective, because during the day we got at least few confirmations that Ukrainians were able to capture the western bridgehead in that settlement. The Ukrainians were using the forces of 128th Mountain Assault Brigade and of course the forces of 130th Reconnaissance Battalion. From the Russian side there was 429th Motorized Rifle Regiment and 291st Motorized Regiment, who was trying to repel the Ukrainians' attack. The Minister of Defense of Russian Federation reported that they managed to repel few attacks in direction of Zheribyanki. Those attacks were repelled from the Ukrainian side. Anyway, the Russians confirms that during the previous 2 days these settlements changed the owner for a few times. Sometimes the Ukrainians were able to push the Russians, then the Russians were able to return control. But currently, according to the latest information we have, this settlement, Petykhatki, is located in the gray zone. So the Russians were forced to step back from this settlement towards more reliable positions on the south. It doesn't mean that Ukrainians controls the settlement. This settlement is in the gray zone, and neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians have their positions inside of this settlement. Now we understand the Ukrainians' plans. As you can see, there are few defense belts in this area. The first one is the northern one. This relies right in front of like the small settlement Sherbaki. This one, Maly-Sherbaki, and this settlement. And as you can see, the support of that settlement goes through Petykhatki and Zheribyanki, these two settlements. So basically, if the Ukrainians are able to push the Russians from this small village, the Russians' defense belt in this area will be collapsed automatically, and the Russians will be forced to step back towards more reliable positions a little bit to the east of this settlement, and they will be forced to create their defense lines somewhere here. And from the Ukrainian side, during the previous days they also made lots of attempts to attack the Russians' positions to the west of Lobkova. They were trying to expand their bridgehead towards the next defense belt, next defense line, and we understand that currently the Ukrainians have a very simple plan, just to expand their defense line and to create new bridgehead, a new defense area along these forest lines. And probably the Ukrainians during the next few days, if they are able to capture and establish control over Petykhatki, they will activate their clashes, and they will be activated in the vicinity of Zheribyanki. And this is going to be the second battle on this bridgehead, because currently Petykhatki is in the gray zone, so the Zheribyanki is the next target. But I'm not saying that Ukrainians will do this or are able to do this. We're just discussing the Ukrainian plans that relies on the surface. The Russian sources reported that during the previous 2 days the total losses of the Ukrainians of Battle of Petykhatki were around 405 or 450 dead Ukrainian soldiers and around 900 wounded Ukrainian soldiers. As you can see, the Ukrainians did have a lot of losses, and the number of losses will increase from day to day. Now we are moving further to Orechov bridgehead. The Ukrainians during the day made at least few support operations. They were attacking from Novodanilovka in direction of Robotina. That attack was repelled by the Russians, and another attack, as usually, took place from Malotokmachka in direction of Novopokrovka, Novofedorovka, and Verbova. All those attacks were repelled by the Russians, but that wasn't like a real counteroffensive. That was support operation, and the Ukrainians were trying just to freeze, pin down the Russians' reserves and not to allow them to send forces to the western flank to this area, because I'm not saying that the Russians don't have enough of reserves, but anyway, they have lost the first defense line. The first settlements have almost lost. Probably they will be able to restore, but anyway, the situation is getting worse and worse for the Russians on this front line from day to day. The Russians published a very interesting video how they were attacking and bombing the Ukrainian positions of probably of 61st 5th Mechanized Brigade to the southwest from Orechov using drones, and they managed to discover and they managed to spot the Russians, the Ukrainians' defense belt, and after that they started attacking and bombing this area using like dropping the grenades, dropping like different types of weapon. So this information confirms the Russian control of the small settlement Nesteryanka, and that Ukrainians located a little bit to the north between these forest lines, and their 65th Brigade is located there. Furthermore, the Russians published a video how they destroy a Ukrainian Bradley to the south of Orechov, to the south of Malotokmachka, and as you can see, using the accurate shell Krasnopol, the Russians destroyed the Bradley, and this area is geolocated, and that what took place exactly between these forest lines on the south of Novodanilovka. Now we are moving further to the east, and we are finding ourselves in the vicinity of Gulay Polye. Very interesting situation happens in the vicinity of Mirne, Zahirne, and Drozhnyanka, between these two settlements. During the previous days, the Ukrainians increased and intensified the usage of commandos and scouts. They are trying to probe and trying to discover the Russian position. They are sending a lot of forces, small squads, 3-5 people, trying to investigate and trying to analyze and find the Russian minefields, Russian like positions, and so on. Today, for example, the Russians repelled even a very powerful attack in the vicinity of Mirne. And the interesting part of this settlement is of this bridgehead is that there is no correct and accurate information about the configuration of the front line exactly on among these fields. Some maps are showing and saying that this settlement like Mirne and Zahirne are under Ukrainian control. Some Russian sources are saying that these settlements are under Russian control. And today the Ministry of Defense reported that one of the Ukrainian attacks was repelled in the vicinity of settlement Mirne. Very interesting bridgehead, and as you can see, the Ukrainians increase and intensify from day to day the activities on these fields, and as you can see, the Russian positions, the edge Russian positions on this bridgehead are very far from the main defense belt, so probably the Ukrainians will activate their attacks in this area in the very near future. Now we are moving further to the east, and let's discuss Vremivka tactical bridgehead. We got a lot of updates from this bridgehead. The Ukrainians made few attempts to attack Priutina from Livadne. Those attacks were repelled by the Russians. Another attempt took place in direction of Rovnopol. The Ukrainians were trying to attack this bridgehead at least from 3 sides from the east. Those attacks were repelled from the north, and those attacks were repelled as well, and from the northwest or from the west. From the east, west, and from the north, the settlement is under 24 hours attacks. All of those attacks were repelled, and the Russians published another video of destroyed Ukrainian armored vehicles that were dropped and somewhere among fields. The Ukrainians, as you can see, are hiding in the brushes, and they're not sitting in armored vehicles because currently it's too dangerous to sit in the vehicles. It's better to get as close as possible to some forest lines, to drop the weapon, to hide in brushes and to wait for an order of some of Ukrainian commanders, and after that they're taking their vehicles again back and starting storming operation. But sometimes they don't even have chances to get their vehicles back because most of them are destroyed using the Russian artillery fire and so on. So all those attacks were repelled. But when talking about the eastern flank of Novoselovka, Staromlynovka bridgehead, we see that Ukrainians did have some progress. In this territory, these fields between Urozhaina, Staromlynovka, Kremenchuk, and Novodonetsk was in under the fog of war. It was very difficult to understand which fields are under Ukrainian control, which fields are under Russian control. But today we got some updates, and basically the Ukrainians are trying to advance from, let's say, Novodonetsk, like along Novodonetsk-Kremenchuk road from the north to the south, trying to cut the road that connects Staromlynovka and Kremenchuk. So this area, and this is the Ukrainians' attempt. This is the area where the Ukrainians are trying to advance using the forces of 1st 4th Tank Brigade, 37th Marine Brigade, and of course like 68 Jaeger Brigade. All those attacks were repelled by the Russians, but anyway, the Russians are repelling attacks, but from day to day we got more and more updates that the Ukrainians, as a result of the previous attack, managed to advance a little bit further to the south. Furthermore, the Russians published another video how their helicopters and air forces support the Russians on the ground. And for example, today the Russians published another video where they managed to destroy using the helicopters at least 3 armored vehicles somewhere on the Vremivka tactical bridgehead, among the fields, among the area where the Ukrainians are trying to attack. As you can see, we see the repeat of the first video. The Ukrainians are getting some forest lines, then they drop the vehicles and they try to hide in the forest line, and meanwhile the Russians destroy and attack simply empty vehicles that were left somewhere among the fields. So this is the tactic. But anyway, and the main problem and the main question that I would like to discuss with you about this battle is that this counter-offensive operation started on the 4th of June, and we have already seen dozens of videos how the Russians were using their helicopters who were supporting their forces on the Vremivka, in the vicinity of Urozhaina, on the fields between Novodonetsk, Kremenchuk, Staromlynovka, and we see dozens of videos, but we still haven't seen even a single video or confirmation that Ukrainians were able to shut down at least one helicopter, the Russian helicopter. Believe me, the Ukrainians do have a lot of weapons, a lot of stingers, a lot of parts to shut down helicopters, but currently they haven't destroyed even one. So this is a very big problem for the Ukrainians, and today the Russian sources reported that currently the Ukrainians intelligence in the United Kingdom intelligence are working on the plan how to destroy the Russians' airfields with helicopters. The main Russian airfield with helicopters is located in the vicinity of Berdyansk. On this helicopter, and the Russians use this base, Berdyansk base, to support and supply their force on Vremivka tactical bridgehead. So these areas, the main base where they're fixing, repairing, and bringing ammo, replace ammo, and so on. And after that, the helicopters flies to the north and support the Russians, not just on the Vremivka tactical bridgehead, but also from Berdyansk. The Russians helps and support their forces on Orechov bridgehead as well. And this is a very big problem and very big pain for the Ukrainians and for the United Kingdom. So we expect the intensifying of Storm Shadow missiles attacks in the direction of Berdyansk within the next few days, because the Ukrainians don't have any other option or solution how to destroy the Russian helicopters. They can't do this using stingers, so that's why they need to do this while these helicopters on the ground on this or that airfield. Furthermore, the Russians reported that Ukrainians stopped doing any attempts to capture Novodonetsk. Currently, the Ukrainians understood that this is useless waste of time and power. The thing is that this Novodonetsk settlement is located between 2 rivers. This is the first river, and basically this is the second river. And every time the Ukrainians enter this settlement, the Russians are retreating from this settlement to the southeast and this direction towards more reliable positions among these trenches and forest line. And as soon as they see that Ukrainians bypass the settlement to the south, the Russians return back and made a strike to the Ukrainian flanks. And this is a very big problem, because during the first phase, the Ukrainians managed to enter this small settlement few times, but every time the night came, they lost position in that settlement. So they just took a decision to bypass and to fortify and increase the power of their defense line along the forest line that they managed to bypass to the south. So this is the situation of the Vremivka tactical bridgehead. Now we are moving further to Marinka. We got some updates from this bridgehead as well. The Ukrainians made few counteroffensives in the southern area of Marinka and in the vicinity of Pobeda. If you remember, the Russians during the previous days made a small counteroffensive in this area, or just offensive, trying to develop their bridgehead in the vicinity of Pobeda, and the Russians managed to do this. Currently, we don't have any geo confirmation location that the Russians managed to capture, but anyway, the Pobeda got more and more encircled by the Russians, and the Ukrainians made few attempts to return lost positions, but all those attacks were repelled. Furthermore, the Russians report that they bombed and shelled the Ukrainian positions among the fields of 109th Territory Defense Brigade, and the main positions of that brigade is in the vicinity of Ugledar, and basically this brigade also is stretched among the fields between Novo-Mikhailovka and Kurakhova. Also, the Russians published another video how they were bombing and shelling the Ukrainians' checkpoints and positions in ammo depots and the western edge of Marinka, and based on that video you can see that the Russians destroyed another checkpoint, probably maybe another ammo depot of Ukrainians in Marinka. And the most important piece of information that you can get from this video, that the Russians currently attacks the Ukrainian positions on the edge, and behind these explosions there are fields and no more buildings. So this video confirms that the Russians have already almost reached the western edge of this settlement, and just probably a few days, they need few days or maybe a week or two to complete the clearing of Marinka. Furthermore, the sources are saying that currently the Russians are focused on the north and trying to push the Ukrainians from this triangle and to establish final control over this territory and to get as close as possible to this small intersection of roads, and using mortars, light mortars, and to cut this supply and support road that goes from Georgievka to western edge of Marinka. Now we're moving further to the north, and we have a lot of updates from Avdiivka. The Russians repelled Ukrainian attacks in the vicinity of Pervomaiska, and the Russians repelled another Ukrainian attack from Keramik in direction of probably Novobakhmutovka and Krasnogorovka. That attack was taken by the Ukrainians from Novokalinovo, and the Russians published another video of usage of flamethrower systems. The Russians were bombing. This video is geolocated. The Russians were bombing and shelling using the flamethrower systems the Ukrainians, the forest located on the east of Avdiivka. This one, the result is significant, and the Russians made a lot of notes and gave a lot of opinion about that attacks. Currently the situation of Avdiivka is very dry. The rainy period of time has ended. Currently it's very hot and it's very dry, and usage of those flamethrower systems increase the effects of the attack in multiple times because of dry weather. And Ukraine is not just under attack, and after that they need to face the consequences of fire that appears in this forest among the dry trees and so on. The total losses of the Ukrainians on the front line between from Orekhov to Donetsk were around 340 soldiers just on Donetsk front line, and around 235 soldiers and 20 armored vehicles on Zaporozhye area. As you can see, more than half a thousand, around 2 battalions were destroyed during the previous 24 hours. The losses are very heavy. Furthermore, the Russians reported that they destroyed few raiders in the vicinity of Dachna and the west of Kurakhova. In the vicinity of Pokrovsk, the Russians destroyed P-18 raiders. Those raiders the Ukrainians were using to discover and to coordinate their S-300 systems against the Russian air forces. Now we are getting closer to New York agglomeration. The Russians attacked the positions of 46th Air Mobile Brigade without any changes on the ground, and now we're going to Artemovsk. There were also no changes on the ground, just the heavy clashes and position fightings without any attempts from the Ukrainian side to attack Russian flanks and so on. Interesting updates came today from Kramatorsk. The Ukrainians lost another Mi-24 in the vicinity of that settlement. The Russians managed, using the air forces, they managed to shot down that helicopter. So another big loss for the Ukrainians. Very fierce fightings currently take place in the vicinity of Bilogorovka, in triangle between Bilogorovka, Seversk and Zarychna, in this area. After the Ukrainians have redeployed the fresh forces of 63rd Mechanized Brigade, the Ukrainians increase and intensify their activities in the Kremenaya Forest, in Bilogorovka and Verkhnyokamyanska. The Russians, from their side, bomb and destroy the headquarters of 95th Brigade in Yampol. If you remember, we discussed a few days ago that Ukrainians have redeployed at least 2 artillery brigades to the Kremenaya Forest, 26th Artillery Brigade and 45th Artillery Brigade. Currently, the Ukrainians are focused on 2 areas. Mainly, they're trying to return control over this salient that they lost during the Russian counteroffensives. And they attack this area at least from 3 sides, from west, north and the south one. And the Ukrainians are trying to regain lost positions in Kremenaya Forest, trying to attack the Russians in this area. And currently the Ukrainians have been activated in the vicinity of Bilogorovka. They're trying to push the Russians' positions from the defense forest belt right in front of this industrial area that the Russians lost control over during the previous weeks. And the Ukrainians activated their attacks from Verkhnyokamyanska in direction of Zolotaryevka. So as we can see, the Ukrainians have replaced some forces, brought fresh forces that were trained with the Western countries, with the Western weapon, and they have activated their attacks in direction of Kremenaya. Furthermore, the Russians are saying that there were at least few very powerful attacks that were repelled by the Russians. But anyway, we see that something very interesting is going to happen probably within the next few days on this territory. Furthermore, the Russians published another video how they were bombing and shelling the Ukrainian positions in Bilogorovka. Buildings, just regular buildings, ammo depots, positions of Ukrainians were under Russian bombing and shelling during the previous 24 hours. As you can see, the Russians are very concentrated on this territory, but there are a lot of hills that are under Ukrainian control, and this is a very big nut for the Russians that they lost. If you remember, during the first offensive operation after the Battle of Lysychansk, the Russians managed to capture these hills and they got almost the Grigorievka was even in the gray zone, but later the Ukrainians made counter-offensive. They returned control over Bilogorovka, and currently the Russians don't have any solutions how to push the Ukrainians back from this bridgehead. Now we're moving further to the north and we are going to talk about Kupiansk and Liman front lines. There are no changes on the ground, just regular battles as we discussed. The Ukrainians are trying, using the fresh redeployed forces of 63rd Brigade to attack and regain the lost positions, and the total loss of the Ukrainians were around 90 soldiers and 4 armored vehicles during the previous 24 hours. So the loss is on the same level. The Russian sources are saying that Ukrainians continue accumulation of their forces on this small, let's call it salient. They have redeployed around few thousand soldiers, few brigades to this bridgehead, and some Russian sources are saying that Ukrainians are planning to attack from this salient in direction of Valuiki, and after that to go to the south and to, let's call it, to encircle Russian defense line on Kremenaya and Kupiansk and Liman front lines. During the previous weeks, the Ukrainians made few attempts to penetrate the Russians' defense orders, but all those attempts were repelled by the Russians, and the only possible solution for them is to attack to the north and then to bypass these fortifications from the north to the south. It's like the opinion of some Russian military experts, but we know that recently the Russians have redeployed the forces of Akhmat Special Unit and Wagner's to this border. So and furthermore, we had update that the Russians managed to create a territorial defense brigade, around 3,000 soldiers in this area. So there are Russian forces to use, and but anyway, this is a very tasty piece of cake for the Ukrainians to attack, and it would be very big media victory for them if they are able to penetrate Russian border in Belgorod and to encircle and to bypass Russian defense on the north of Lugansk area and the Kupiansk and Liman front lines. Now let's move to the south one more time, and today these days these Western sources, Russian sources, published the video of Dnipro River. As you can see, the Dnipro was dried till zero, we can say, and currently there are no problem to There is no water at all. It's a very big disaster. Some military experts are saying that Ukrainians wait a little bit and probably in a month or two they're going to start using this territory to attack Energodar from the north, just using light infantry and light vehicles. The Russians reported that as a result of artillery duels in Kherson, the Ukrainians lost 40 soldiers and 2 armored vehicles. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in Ukraine. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.